All right, welcome to the Truth and Taxation hearing of the Rhode Island Olivia Lake Lillian Independent School District number 2534. And the time is 6:32, and we'll turn it over to Lindsay.
All right, thanks everyone for being here tonight and listening to this public hearing for the truth and taxation and levy information. And just one housekeeping thing is just wanted to remind you guys that we'll post this presentation PowerPoint to the website so that it can be viewed after the meeting tonight. All right, so we'll get going here. The Minnesota Truth and Taxation Law requires for certain steps to happen before adopting the levy for the following year. So those two requirements are that we have to mail a notice out to each property tax owner of the county, and we have to conduct a public truth and taxation hearing, and that's what we're here tonight for. Some requirements of what needs to be discussed in a truth and taxation public meeting is you need to discuss the new proposed property tax levies for 2023 in this case. Provide and discuss information on the current budget, which is fiscal year 23 for us, and the public must be given time to comment on the tax levy and budget and ask any questions they may have. And that's per Minnesota state statute. Just a quick overview, we'll start with the tax system can be quite overwhelming and complex, but hopefully after going through some of these next slides, it will feel a little bit better. So some points to remember. The revenue formulas are actually set by state legislator, except for if you have a voter-approved referendum on the ballot. The local levy and state aid mix are also set by the state. And an increase in local taxes does not necessarily mean an increase in revenues for the school district. There's lots of other things that go into your property taxes, such as county or city. The process is for the certification is the state law gets set to the maximum or the approved amount. The Department of Education computes the levy for us, and then the school board will certify the levy. And this is kind of what the levy calendar looks like. So in June, we go through a process we call the summer levy, and that's when the district goes through and provides the data that is necessary to MDE. In August, in the August board meeting, if you remember, you guys set the date and location of this levy hearing. September, there was an agenda line item to certify the proposed levy. Here in November, the county mails out the levy notices of when our public hearing was going to be. And then in December, we'll certify the final levy. So who and what impacts your tax bill? There's a lot of things that go in and can cause increases or decreases. One is anything that's set at the state level for the formulas. The school board, such as if there's an operating or building referendum. Also, the county assessor is going to go out on an annual basis and do property values. So the swing in your property values will cause an increase or a decrease depending on which direction it goes. A lot of the levies are based upon pupil counts. So if a district has swings up and down in pupil counts, that will also cause impacts. And the state also does an equalization aid. Another big piece that gets talked about a lot, it was enacted in law in 2017, is the egg to school credit. And it affects when you have existing debt or a bond out there, which currently there is none for Bold. So the egg to school credit isn't as large as it is in other districts, but any potential bond referendum that would come into play. What it does is a reduction for farmers and timber owners. It's scheduled to increase to 70% in 2023. And the revenue comes from state income in other tax revenues. It's not a county or a school district thing. They balance it through state credits. They did have a bill out there that hasn't been signed, but they are trying to push to increase that to 85%. So right now, currently though, here is kind of the history and the percentage increase and what the percentage will be. So it shows here that's going to go up 10% to 70% for next year. And where you can find that on your property tax statement is right there under the proposed tax. You'll see that there's a credit that will get placed there. So that's how you will receive the credit through there. It's not right up front. It comes through when you pay your property taxes and file your tax return. Another good thing that I think is important to look at, and it's been discussed many times across many districts, but it is getting harder and harder to have balanced budgets. It takes a lot of work into balancing revenue and expenses. And one of the things that's important to look at, especially with the cost of living that has happened over the last 8 to 12 months, is when you look at the revenue that comes in a district and you look at the general education formula, if we were to apply the same index factor for inflation to that formula, we're $1,263 behind where we should be in the formula if we were to keep up with inflation. So roughly, if where our ADMs are currently, just a rough calculation, that's an additional $787,000. So that's a lot of money. To kind of look at how much of the revenue comes from property taxes, here's kind of a nice portrait of the different sources that come into the district. And you can see state aids by far is the biggest piece of the revenue that comes in. And then it's property taxes, other, and federal. Federal swung a little bit the last few years related to the pandemic, but usually that's a smaller piece of the pie as well. Here's a nice pie chart that kind of shows the different or the major funds that a district has and what portion of the fund is levy. So you can see the general fund is about 15% and all other revenue is 85%. In the community fund, it's 20% and the rest is 80%, which is usually participation fees and a little bit of state. And then food service, no levy dollars come through that. That is all federal and state and participation fees. Another way to look at it is to look how the levy is distributed by fund. And because the general fund is the biggest operating fund of the district, and it's where all of the education lies, 85 or 95%, of the levy dollars go to the general fund, and about 5% of it is for the community education fund. So this is just a portrait of where the levy currently is at. So the payable 21-22 is actually revenue for this current fiscal year, because the levy that gets approved is going to be a year behind of when it hits revenue for the district. So right now, that is the $1,361,977 is our current budget for the revenue for fiscal year 23. And for fiscal year 24, when the levy is finalized in December, that will be the budgeted revenue for fiscal year 24. So just so you know that there's just a lag in what levy you're approving and how it comes in as revenue for the district. So the next piece of this TNT presentation, we want to go over budget information for the current year. Just kind of a good overview of when I'm talking about these different funds, what kind of goes into it. For the general fund, the revenue, the biggest chunk of revenue is based upon student enrollment. The expenditure side provides instruction to the students, and it gets supplies and other educational activities. Another big piece of the general fund is our special education and other federal mandated programs like the summer migrant program that we have. Pupil transportation is another big cost. We'll see a couple other slides of how that looks for a district. Then you have your facility operations and management and other capital expenditures, improvements, and LTFM. For food service, that is the school breakfast and lunch program. And for community service fund, the levy is mainly based upon the adult population in a district. So it's calculated a little bit differently than the general fund levies are, which is more pupil count. Except for the early childhood levy, that's based upon your number of children under the 5 years or younger. There's also enrichment programs at any level that run through the community service fund. You have your ECFE, your school readiness, and your adult basic education. So here's a way to look at the budget just by revenue and by fund. And you can see that the 23 budget is up from the actual fiscal year 22 budget. And the majority of that is due to timing of when federal funds are going to actually be, so the entitlements are there, but when we actually are going to spend them, that's when you budget the revenue and the expenditures. So when we start doing replacement schedules and other type of purchases with the federal dollars, that's when it's hitting the budget. That's why our revenues are up compared to fiscal year 22 to budget for those potential costs coming. The food service actually goes the other way when you compare your actual to your budget. And the reason for that is and you probably heard me say this a million times when we do go over the budget, but over the last couple of years, we've been running under what we call the summer food program, which the reimbursement rates are much higher. And everyone was free. For fiscal year 23, we're going to go back to the national food program where the rates aren't as higher, and you do then sometimes see fluctuation in usage. So we conservatively budgeted for the unknown of what the whole fiscal year would look like. The community service fund revenues are budgeted less as well. And if you remember in June, the resolution was passed to reallocate those committed funds and then use 250,000 of those committed funds to start the payback process of the community service fund debt. And so that's why the revenues in 22 are much higher, is because that's how the process works. It hits revenue in the community service fund and expense in the general fund. So that's why it looks much higher. It didn't have our normal operating revenues in there. And then the trust is just based upon the number of scholarships that are given out in a year. And then when those scholarships are claimed based upon whatever criteria they need to meet before they can get the scholarship. Here's just another way to look at our budget and compare it to last year in a graph form, just to kind of show that the general fund is the biggest piece of our budget, and then food service, community education, and the trust fund. Now we'll move on to expenditures. And as you can see, just like in the revenue, the expenditures for 23 are up compared to actual, and that's for a couple things as well. One, for those federal purchases, so your revenue goes up, but so are your expenditures. And then we all know that our cost of living has gone up, so it's making assumptions of contracts and things that are going to be set in place, but are potentially going to be at a higher cost because of where the market is. It also has, if you remember when we were doing the fiscal year, adopting the 23 budget, we have the roof project in there at $400,000. And that's going to use up the reserves that we built in LTFM to pay for it. So when you're looking at the revenue compared to the expenses, just remember when the expenses look bigger, that's because we're using some reserves. The food service is up compared to actual, which is opposite of the revenues. But if you remember when we were talking about adopting the budget, the federal government has regulations where you can only have so much of your fund balance compared to your operating expenses. It's 3 months. And because we've been operating on their summer food program for multiple years at a higher reimbursement rate, it helped build up that fund balance, but you also can't have too much fund balance. So we budgeted to do equipment upgrades in the kitchen. And so that's why the budget is larger. It's spending some of that reserve down that we're required to spend down. The community education fund, the decrease in the fiscal year 23 budget compared to the 22 actual is a lot of those different things that we talked about that we were going to do for budget savings, like doing a time and effort and changing how we allocate some of our contracts and the number of hours in some of the hourly staff in the community service fund. And there also the big change was the summer rec program with the partnership. And then the trust fund is based upon what we have averaged for paying out scholarships in a year. Another way to look at the how the general fund dollars are spent is by what I would call program or department areas. So like your instructional program is obviously the biggest percentage, and that's because that's where all of the cost go for the education of the students. The next piece is your pupil support services. And what goes into there in general is going to be your transportation. That's probably the biggest piece. Your staff development. It's going to have your guidance and social work contracts or payroll. That's kind of the biggest pieces of the pupil support department. The next would be your building and district administration and your instructional support. A lot of things that are going to go there is board, your administration. In the instructional support services, it's also going to have your dean of students. It's going to have any other hourly employees that help support the district. Another way to look at it is in pie chart, and it's the same percentage as we see before, but you can just see that where our budget lies, the majority of it is in your instructional support services where it should be, because that's we're in a service organization for education, and so that's going to take up the most of your budget. And then just one other way to look at the general fund is not by department area or program area, but actually the purpose or the object, we call it. And you can see the salary and wages and benefits. When you add that, that's almost 60% of the budget, which makes sense when that's what you need to operate a school, is to have your teachers, your paraprofessionals, your food service, all that in order to operate. The next piece of it is your purchase services, and that's at 31.79%. And like I mentioned before, the biggest piece of that is going to be the transportation contract. That makes up the largest piece of that. And then the other areas are quite small, but you have your supplies and materials at 5%, and you have your capital expenditures or your bigger equipment purchases at just under 2%. So that is the end of my presentation for the Truth in Taxation. And now is the time for any questions or public comment regarding the presentation or any other questions along the budget.
On those pie charts, is there a standard for a school district where you can see if you are within the guidelines of the pie? You know what I mean? Like, so one isn't getting to be too big or one's not big enough. Are there guidelines where a school district should be?
I wouldn't say that there's necessarily guidelines, but I bet you that we could probably find some research or a study that's been done on like what an average would look like. You know, obviously, depending on if you have any major like budgeted projects or, you know, these federal dollars, they'll also swing your percentages a little bit. So like a given year might be a little bit different, but on an average, actually they normally say like 75% of your budget is anywhere from, I should say 65 to 75% is going to be salary and benefits. So we're under the average that school districts normally see for their percentage of budgets for that. And then, like I said, the other ones, purchase services, is all depends on if your transportation is outsourced, contracted versus internal, because that also changes what area that it's under, or if you have any other big projects coming along where you'd be budgeting to pay any type of contractor or vendor. So that'll swing it a little bit, but on average, purchase services would be large like that as well.
Okay.
If you contract your transportation, that is.
Because, with the way the economy has been and the way the prices are increasing and stuff, at one point, is there like a red flag or a danger flag saying like, let's say that purchase services starts taking all that light green one up now, and now all those other ones get squished because that contracted service is getting so expensive, and then the wages, let's say they take up 3/4. At one point, do those other small pies that are still part of what we need? Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I sure do.
So you don't want to
Yep.
squish it too much. Where do you draw the line, or what?
I think it actually would depend on honestly doing needs assessments and where the district is and what the needs are. Because obviously those needs of the students are going to help you kind of shape that budget as to what needs to be done. So, but I would be nervous if the purchase services was, starting to get too big of the pie, because really you should see it when you're in a service organization, like educating our students, you should actually see it more on the salary and benefit side of things, unless you're structured a little differently, which in this case we're not. But so yes, it's good to watch this all the time to make sure that based upon your needs assessments and where you're sitting, that the expenditures seem to be in the right categories.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just surprised at the supplies and materials, because you're buying these things for the kids to learn. It's only 5%.
It's just, if you think about it, though, supplies and materials are compared to a full year worth of salaries, it's just so much smaller when you're looking at it. So when you're taking the total budget, it's just a small piece of it.
Right. I just want to make sure that all of our staff have what they need.
Yep.
To teach the kids.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Lindsay.
All right, thank you very much.
Who's the brave one that knocked?